our next speaker is Ryan OShea, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. I've known Ryan, I've worked with him. He's a brilliant social media expert, but not only that, far more advanced and skilled than those particular skills. He is the host of Future Grind, and Future Grind is a very innovative and original podcast about human enhancement, augmentation, the future, science, and technology. One of the interesting things about Ryan is the co-founder of the artificial intelligence and startup called Behavior, something that we have discussed in our recent panel. And he uses the machine learning automated just-in-time intervention to tackle addiction. And that's a very serious issue today. And I'd like to applaud Ryan for his work in that area. He was recently named a top 10 team in the third and final round of the $5 million IBM Watson AI X Prize. Ryan has represented NASA and Caltech's Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a solar system ambassador and served both as a World Economics Forum global shaper. So Ryan, it is a pleasure and honor to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Natasha. It's great to be here. This has been a great summit so far, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. So as you just heard, my name is Ryan OShea, and I am the host of the Future Grind podcast. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that you can see the slides. So the Future Grind podcast, as Natasha explained, explores the ethics and implications of emerging science and technology. But today I'm here to speak with you through my role as the co-founder of the Human Augmentation Institute. And in this, we're going to talk about ethics, and we're going to talk about what someone can and cannot do to their own or someone else's body. And these are going to be questions that I don't have answers to, and that can lead to some polarizing and controversial places. And because these topics can be so contentious, many people avoid them altogether. But I think that these are topics that we need to address sooner rather than later, because we're already starting to deal with the consequences of putting them off. But before we get into some of that, what do we mean by human augmentation? Well, there are some types of human augmentation that most people are already quite familiar with, such as medical augmentation, which can include surgeries and prescription drugs and other medication. Medical augmentation is almost universally for therapeutic use. It's primarily focused on the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. And then there's body modification. Body modification has existed for purposes in cultures around the world for thousands of years. Scarification, teeth sharpening, ear stretching, foot binding, and corsets are all examples of this. In modern society, body modification most often refers to tattoos and body piercings. And unlike medical procedures, what's referred to as body modification today is typically for aesthetic purposes. They are more about appearance than functionality. And these procedures are typically performed by a trained professional, but not a medical professional, and not in a medical environment. And there's this interesting combination of the two that I've already mentioned previously that are combined together, and that is cosmetic surgery. Cosmetic surgery features medical professionals using approved medical equipment largely for elective aesthetic procedures. So here we're combining the goals and aesthetic focus of body modification with the training and regulation of the medical industry. So those are the types of augmentation that we're probably all familiar with. And even if we've never had a surgery or have never gotten a tattoo or piercing, we're likely all actively augmenting ourselves in some way. The use of hair dye and makeup and fake nails is prevalent. Right now, I have a thin sheet of plastic between my eyelid and my eye, a contact lens, which helps me see better. And many of us use coffee or energy drinks for their stimulant effects. These are examples of humans using their understanding of science and biology to change their physical or mental state, to customize what they want to be. And all of this we've talked about so far is largely accepted by society. Even the tattoos and piercings and variations of hair color that have been stigmatized over the past decades in many cultures are becoming normalized and commonplace. That stigma that used to be associated with them is going away. But now there are new and other boundary pushing procedures that are taking their place. And I want to reiterate that this isn't new. There have long been people working to change the form and function of their bodies to better match their gender identity, for example, or to take control of their reproductive health. But what is new is the increasing democratization of access to the tools of science and technology. There are community makerspaces and biospaces that people can access, and many are making their own workspaces in their garages and basements and in their homes. And this is changing everything. And what it's giving rise to is a growing trend of people actively pioneering and participating in a new type of human augmentation. These people aren't solely interested in the largely skin deep aesthetic nature of most body modification, and they're not really interested in the solely therapeutic uses of the medical industry. What they want to do is use augmentations to overcome human biological limitations and customize their experiences. So, throughout the 2010s, we've seen an increase in the popularity and acceptance of augmentations such as implanted magnets and RFIDs. These are inserted inside the body under the skin, and they change in a minor way what the human body is capable of, whether it's storing information, verifying identity, attracting certain metal, sensing electromagnetic fields, and so much more. And we've quickly moved beyond that. This is Grindhouse Wetware's Circadia device, an implant capable of sending biometric data from inside the body to a tablet or phone. And this wasn't developed in a university or corporate R&D lab. It was developed in 2013 in the basement of a rented house in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. And here it is inside the body. This is a screenshot of Tim Cannon's forearm from a Vice documentary that they did on him. This was a procedure that was performed at a body modification festival in Germany. And the same thing goes for Grindhouse Wetware's Northstar, a powered device that lights up inside the body and can mimic bioluminescence. In the next slide, I'll show it being inserted into the body. So here's a shot of that. And here it is glowing under the skin. This was in 2015, but in terms of legality and regulation and ethics, all of this is operating in an undefined gray area, and that's leading to some problems. One of the problems is that these devices I've described here are subdermal devices that are simply placed beneath the skin. This is well within the capabilities of the body modification artists that perform these procedures, but the field is quickly advancing. There's been talk of implants that interact directly with the nervous system, with various organs, and ultimately with the brain. We'll likely reach the limits of the capabilities of body modification artists, leaving medical doctors the only people who currently have the skills and knowledge to perform these procedures. But even if they are personally willing, are they going to be allowed to? What happens at this point is one of the problems we need to solve. But that's just one of the legal issues, and there are others. So here's the story of Meow. Meow is a biohacker based in Australia who implanted the chip from his transit card into his hand, meaning that he no longer had to carry around the physical card and could simply swipe his hand at the turnstile to gain access to the bus or the train. And for this, he was charged with traveling without a valid ticket and taken to court, where he was fined. He filed an appeal and eventually he won, the fine was dropped, but he did still have to pay the court costs. And this is something that could have been addressed proactively if there was regulation in place, but there's not. And here's Josiah Zainer, a fairly controversial former NASA scientist who has publicly self-experimented with CRISPR. But he also runs an educational company that sells the tools of science, kits, and classes to the public. Because of his work, Josiah was investigated by the state of California for practicing medicine without a license. The investigation was eventually closed and no further action was taken, but at that point the damage to his work and business had already been done. And then there's Rich Lee, who is known for his experiments in human augmentation. But after a divorce, his ex-wife filed a motion to give her full custody of their children, citing Rich's biohacking as a primary reason. And I think this is the most interesting case here. This is Brendan McCarthy, who goes by the name Dr. Evil. He's a body modification artist in the UK who has been sentenced to 40 months in jail for inflicting grievous bodily harm on multiple people. The charges were for a tongue-splitting procedure, removing an ear, and removing a nipple. These are people who actively came to Brendan for these procedures, consented to them, and are happy with the results. They're not the ones that filed the complaints. They're happy with what happened, but apparently the law thinks that's not allowed. The judgment said that what the defendant undertook for reward in this case was a series of medical procedures for no medical reason. The personal autonomy of his customers does not provide a justification for removing body modification from the ambit of the law of assault. So even though he had consent and did this on willing people, he was sent to jail. And in these cases, there's no clear answer. I think it's very reasonable arguments could be made for both sides of these issues in all of these cases. But there's a reason there's so much debate and confusion, because there are no set standards, regulations, or guidelines on these topics. And that gray area causes confusion. And there doesn't seem to be a push by governments, licensing, or regulating bodies to address these issues. But they need to be addressed because the number of these cases and the size of the problem overall is only going to increase. So this is why I joined with a few others and started an organization called the Human Augmentation Institute, which we plan to be a nonprofit with the mission of upholding bodily autonomy and ensuring that any efforts in human augmentation are done ethically, safely, and responsibly. And the organization has a few different initiatives. We seek to increase the accessibility of resources on bioethics, safety, and security to make sure that they are available to people in the human augmentation community and the existing literature can be referenced. We also want to seek to compile a list of experts in various fields related to law and chemistry and hardware design and software design so that people working in human augmentation can get informal feedback and advice so they don't make a mistake along the way. And this provides an opportunity to raise concerns around methodology, safety, and ethics. And we'll engage the public, regulatory agencies, governments, and other stakeholders in conversations to promote human augmentation literacy, increase transparency, and avoid unjust policy and regulation. And perhaps most importantly in the near term, we've worked with those active in the community over the past 2 years to establish the Human Augmentation Code of Ethics, a set of guiding principles and values that can serve as a reference for those engaging in human augmentation and can help explain the values within human augmentation to those who are not involved in the community. This initiative came out of the biohacking community gathering in 2018 called Grindfest. We knew we wanted to have as many relevant voices involved and get good feedback. So the Code of Ethics was created over an extended period of time through a series of discussions, workshops, and public comment periods. These formal and informal gatherings occurred at events throughout 2019, such as DEF CON and Biohack the Planet in Las Vegas, and the Please Try This at Home conference in Pittsburgh, and also the Global Community Bio Summit in MIT Media Lab, which is pictured here. So there were 3 official drafts of the Human Code of Ethics, and each draft had a public comment period. All the feedback was taken into account, and the first version of the Code of Ethics was formally adopted in a public meeting on January 17th. It consisted of 7 principles. We'll go through them here. First is bodily autonomy. The ability of an individual capable of informed consent to make decisions about their own body is paramount. All augmentation must be voluntary. The voluntary aspect of this should diminish any fears of mandatory implants, which we hear quite often. But I think the obvious question raised in this one is, what does it mean to be capable of informed consent? That's an extremely hard question, and it leads right into our next principle, which is informed consent. All parties participating in or undergoing a human augmentation must know and consent to the recognized risk and benefits of the augmentation and understand that some may be unknown. So, to be capable of informed consent, someone would have to understand and agree to the recognized risk of a procedure. And if someone cannot do that, either because of their state of development or health issues, or because they are under the influence of some substance, can they exercise bodily autonomy? These are very difficult questions, but I don't think their inherent difficulty negates their usefulness within the code of ethics, because I think these are values that need to be shared. And their difficulty just means that we need to have more informed conversation so that we can get that through the next principle, which is transparency. The human augmentation community is committed to the sharing of ideas, knowledge, data, and results in a clear, open, and public way. There are, of course, issues of intellectual property and trade secrets that might come into play here. But in general, there is broad agreement that those engaging in human augmentation should be transparent about the goals of their work, what they know, and their results. When it comes to human augmentation, we don't want the same failures repeated again and again. And we recognize that success can mean benefits for all. And this principle is related to a commitment to open access. Support accessible science and technology in the pursuit of democratizing access to human augmentation. So this principle deals directly with the concern that human augmentation will mean a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, and that will increase the gap that already exists, meaning that those on the bottom can't get this technology. And I think that concern is a bit overblown, but I do think it's serious. And I think that it's, in some ways, in competition with the next principle, which is safety. Always strive to minimize risk and negative impact to others and the environment. Implement the best possible practices given available resources, recognizing that not acting also has consequences. I think that the balance between open access and safety is a conundrum we're facing as a society. I see these as the two main options when it comes to human augmentation technology. If we prioritize safety, then experiments in human augmentation should have to go through the equivalent of multi-phase clinical trials. There should be ethical review boards, and regulatory bodies should approve devices and procedures procedures should only be performed by trained professionals. Perhaps the equivalent of medical doctors, and also inappropriate environments. This will make human augmentation quite safe, but it will also delay it and make it extremely expensive, and would create a demand for illicit underground activities and devices. And perhaps augmentative tourism will become as popular as medical tourism is today. This could be how you get that divide between the haves and the have-nots. On the other hand, we could prioritize open access. We could let people consent to whatever procedure and whatever situation they are comfortable with. This will democratize access to augmentative tech and could speed development, but there would undoubtedly be complications and deaths from the unregulated human augmentation. So these are two extremes, and it's likely that what we end up with will be somewhere in the middle, but it's a hard thing to balance. I also want to draw attention to the last sentence here. Recognize that not acting also has consequences. This is extremely important, and I don't think we give this fact enough consideration. Final two principles are respect, uphold the dignity, worth, and privacy of all people. Consider your impact on others and the environment. And we mentioned environment here. We're talking about both the built environments and the natural environment. We need to consider externalities, indirect effects, and unintended consequences of human augmentation. And finally, diversity and inclusion. The human augmentation community strives to foster acceptance and inclusion. We do not tolerate discrimination or harassment in any form. So where do we stand now? Well, the Human Augmentation Institute is currently a team of 3 and includes Amanda Plimpton of Livestock Labs and Jacob Boss of Indiana University. And we're a growing team, and we're cognizant of the voices and perspectives that are not formally represented in this organization. So if you're interested in getting involved, please reach out. Our main goal for now is funding and getting the overhead to cover the organization's getting off the ground and starting on our initiatives. So if anyone has any thoughts on this, I'm happy to hear from you. And I'd love to get in the weeds on all of these topics. And there's so much more I wanted to cover here, but I didn't really have time. So if these topics are of interest of you, I suggest checking out Future Grind, where we frequently discuss this and much more. So I'll wrap up there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Very fascinating talk. I have to admit that sometimes I had to close my eyes to not see particularly gruesome procedures. So we do have a few questions coming from the community and a lot of debates as usual, given the specificity of the topic and the peculiarity of the topic, actually. So I was wondering, are you augmented yourself, aside from your contact lenses? If you want to answer, you don't have to, of course.
I am not. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, a lot of the current human augmentation work grows out of the body modification community. So people who were interested in tattoos and piercings. I don't have any tattoos and I don't have any piercings. I'm not interested in the aesthetic modifications. I'm primarily interested in functional modifications. So when something comes along that I can put in my body to augment myself that I cannot get from a wearable or I cannot get from an external source, and the benefits outweigh the risks, I will absolutely do that. I just haven't seen that we're there yet with most of the things that do exist, but I very much look up to and admire the pioneers who are putting their bodies literally on the line to make that future tech possible, because this is iterative development. You don't start with the jet plane. You start with a dangerous plane flying at the beach in North Carolina with the Wright brothers. And now we're getting to the point where we have jet planes. So that's how this iterative design grows, and that's what I'm looking forward to.
Well, the Wright brothers plane was also fairly dangerous, though. So yes, it was a really and so we have now procedures that are particularly pretty safe, like under skin chip transplants, and yet these are seen with a lot of suspicion from the outer community, from the outside transhumanist community. How can we overcome this? And how can we overcome these fears?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's interesting to bring that up, because I think a lot of people are open to getting implants and augmentations if it's done by medical professionals in a medical setting. And what that means is you might know a relative, or you might yourself have a prosthetic limb or an implant or some kind of thing in your body that a medical doctor put there for therapeutic or health reasons. And the people that have these things in their body often look at people who have RFID tags and magnets and think that that's bizarre and weird. But in many ways, the most cyborg among us are the people who have implants for medical purposes. They are the ones that have been doing this for the longer time, and it's more integrated into their bodies and their day-to-day activities than any of the biohacking we're talking about now are. The original cyborgs are these people who are doing it for medical reasons. So I think that is one way to point that out, to make people more willing and accepting to understand what else is happening and be more welcoming to the new advancements in cyborg technology, if that's what you want to call it. But one thing I think we need to consider is that at some point, whether or not you're augmented might depend on what everyone else is doing. Because if you're competing for a job with augmented humans, you might not have the luxury of not augmenting yourself.
I'm reading some questions from the community, and most of these questions are about normalization of this approach, which is pretty much what we've been discussed already. You are obviously proposing regulation to this sector, to body augmentation. My main concern is that if we allow regulators to come in, then the process will be particularly slow. And by the time that we get regulations, the technology or an approach could be already old. How can we fix this? And do we actually need regulators to come in?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there is a problem that exists in many industries.
All
I
of
think
them.
we've seen it already happening in self-driving cars. I think we've seen it with unmanned aerial vehicles and drones, where the regulation is not keeping up with the technology. And because of that, in many ways, is delaying it. And the good example that I use is I've been approached by investors who are willing to invest in companies that are creating technology for elective human augmentation, but they're reluctant to throw their money behind something that tomorrow could be deemed illegal or could be regulated into oblivion. And if there was some regulation in place, there would be a feeling of safety for investors and business people that they could get involved in this industry and trust that it's going to remain consistent and steady. And just to clarify one thing there, I don't necessarily want government imposed or regulatory body imposed regulations at this point. What I'm really advocating for is community adopted regulations that people hold themselves to. And I want this to happen for the reason that I see government regulation eventually being inevitable. And when it happens, I do not want it to be heavy handed and unjust. I can just imagine someone being killed by a human augmentation procedure. It's eventually bound to happen, statistically speaking. And if there's no regulation in place when that happens, I imagine the clampdown from governments will be severe. If we already have community adopted regulations that we sign on to and we explain, what I'm hoping is that the government bodies just take what we've already established and adopt that as official policy rather than trying to rewrite the rules when they don't know how the game is played.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's also interesting to see how, compared to a few years ago, these, talks about body augmentation and body modification have become more mainstream, also thanks to the cinematography industry, of course, like Black Mirror or even Years and Years, which poses an interesting problem in that specific series, where one of the characters get body augmentation, but all the technology that she augmented in her body are actually owned by the government, because that's the only way that she can get safe body augmentation. Could that be a risk?
I think it could definitely be a risk. There's someone I reference quite often. I believe his name is Hugo Campos, who had a implants controlling his heart, and he wanted to get access to the data from this device, but the company wouldn't let him. He didn't technically own the device of his own heart. He didn't even own the device that was in his body and the data generated from it. So what he was trying to do was figure out what in his daily life was causing this arrhythmia or what other issue he was facing. And to figure this out, he had to manually write down what he was doing and then check his vitals and then write those down. And over a series of weeks, identify that it was a certain type of alcohol that was giving him this heart problem. And if he had access to that data, he wouldn't have had to do any of that. He would have been able to just figure it out right from looking at the data. So I believe that you should own whatever is in your body. That should be under your possession. You should be able to access the data from it, hack it however you see fit, and do whatever you want with it. I'm very concerned with these plans where a lot of medical devices that people have in their bodies, they don't even understand that they are kind of leasing those from the company and they don't own them. And this is a major issue that we need to have a community discussion and let it be a market-based decision. That's how I think that most decisions should be made. But just let people know that this is happening and to make the appropriate decisions and to kind of vote with their dollars or what they choose to get at that point.
Ryan, thanks a lot. I would love to keep this conversation going, but we have to close this talk now. So thanks a lot for your time and for your answers. It's been a wonderful talk.
Thank you.